On the night of June 28, 1979, 11 federal agents were eliminated across 3 locations in Sevier County, Tennessee, in what would become known as the Patterson revenge killings. All adults, all employees of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The method was calculated. Hunting rifles fired from ambush positions, shotguns at close range in a motel parking lot, and explosives placed under vehicles to ensure maximum casualties. The perpetrators weren't domestic terrorists with political manifestos or organized crime syndicates expanding operations. They were 3 members of the Patterson family, a father and his 2 sons, moving through the June darkness with military precision, hunting federal agents the way their ancestors had hunted revenuers for 90 years. The FBI would later call it the deadliest attack on federal law enforcement officers in American history up to that point. But the motive wasn't about politics, wasn't about organized resistance to government authority, wasn't even about a long-standing blood feud. It was about a Moonshine raid conducted 3 weeks earlier that destroyed $180,000 worth of equipment and resulted in the arrest of Lucas Patterson's youngest son, and one man's absolute conviction that federal agents who enforced tyrannical laws on his property deserved death according to codes older than the Constitution itself. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Sevier County sprawled across 597 square miles of eastern Tennessee in 1979, pressed against the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where peaks rose over 6,000 feet and valleys cut so deep that some hollows never saw direct sunlight. The terrain was spectacularly beautiful and dangerously isolated, perfect for people who wanted to live beyond the reach of government interference. Population stood around 41,000, most concentrated in Sevierville and Gatlinburg, tourist towns that were beginning to boom with the rise of Dollywood and Smoky Mountain tourism. But the rest of the county remained stubbornly rural, scattered across hollows with names like Fighting Creek, Thunderhead, and Copperhead. Communities where families had lived for 8 generations and viewed federal authority with the same suspicion their great-great-grandfathers had shown toward Union soldiers in 1865. June in eastern Tennessee meant temperatures climbing into the low 90s during the day, humidity so oppressive you could barely breathe, dropping to the high 60s at night when fog rolled down from the mountains and turned the world ghostly. The air smelled like honeysuckle and wild roses, wood smoke from cooking fires, and underneath it all, the sweet fermentation smell of corn mash that anyone familiar with moonshine could identify from half a mile away. At night you could hear the entire hollow settling, whippoorwills calling, distant dogs barking, the occasional rumble of trucks on Highway 321 carrying tourists toward Gatlinburg who had no idea what happened in these mountains after dark. But 1979 was a complicated year for Appalachia. The region was caught between 2 worlds, traditional mountain culture that had existed for 200 years, and modern America that was rapidly encroaching. Tourism was bringing money into Sevier County at unprecedented rates, Gatlinburg transforming from a mountain town into a destination resort, developers buying up land, building hotels and attractions, bringing jobs and outsiders, and change that old-timers resented. At the same time, the federal government was cracking down on illegal activities that mountain people had always considered their birthright. Moonshining, which had been tolerated with a wink and a nod for generations, was now being targeted by ATF agents who had better equipment, better funding, and a mandate to eliminate illegal distilling operations. The culture clash was inevitable and violent. Making shine was what mountain people had done since their Scots-Irish ancestors brought the knowledge across the Atlantic in the 1700s. It wasn't crime in their minds. It was tradition, heritage, survival, resistance to government overreach that had started with the Whiskey Rebellion in 1791 and never really ended. Federal taxes on legal alcohol were seen as tyranny, pure and simple. Government stealing money from working people to fund programs nobody in these mountains wanted or needed. By 1979, moonshining had evolved from subsistence activity into serious business, with some operations producing thousands of gallons annually, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in untaxed income. The Patterson family had been making moonshine since 1889, when Lucas Patterson's great-grandfather set up his first still in a hollow so remote that federal agents didn't even know it existed until the 1920s. For 90 years, the Patterson operation had survived Prohibition, survived the Depression, survived multiple federal raids by being smarter, more careful, and more willing to defend their property with violence than most families. They weren't criminals in their own estimation. They were patriots, Americans exercising their constitutional rights to make a living without government interference, defending their property from federal tyranny the same way their ancestors had defended it from British tyranny in 1776. This wasn't crime. This was resistance. This was what free men did when government overstepped its authority. Lucas Patterson, at 56 years old in 1979, had been raised on stories about revenue agents getting shot at, chased off, occasionally killed when they pushed too hard into hollows where they weren't welcome. His grandfather had killed a revenuer in 1932, shot him dead when the agent tried to seize equipment, and got away with it because no jury in Sevier County would convict a mountain man for defending his property from federal thieves. That was the code Lucas had been raised with, the code he'd passed to his sons. You protected what was yours from anyone who tried to take it, government badge or not. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had been created in 1972, replacing the old alcohol tax unit with a more aggressive agency that had better training, better equipment, and a mandate to crack down on illegal distilling with unprecedented force. By 1979, ATF agents in eastern Tennessee were conducting sophisticated operations using helicopters, infrared cameras, and informants to locate stills that had operated undetected for decades. The old game of cat and mouse between moonshiners and revenuers had evolved into something more dangerous. Federal agents were no longer local boys who understood mountain culture and knew when to look the other way. They were professional law enforcement officers from places like Washington and Atlanta, men who saw moonshining as serious crime rather than cultural tradition, who didn't care about codes or heritage or constitutional arguments about government overreach. They had a job to do, and they did it with efficiency that terrified old-time moonshiners who'd never faced this level of federal pressure. Lucas James Patterson was 56 years old that June, though he looked older, weathered by decades of physical labor and constant stress of running illegal operations while staying ahead of federal agents. He stood 5'11", lean and wiry, with the kind of toughness that came from a lifetime of manual work in terrain that broke softer men. His face was angular, deeply lined, with pale gray eyes that rarely showed emotion but somehow communicated everything he was thinking. A thick beard, more gray than brown, covered his jaw and grew halfway down his chest. His hands were huge, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained from handling copper and corn mash. A scar ran from his right temple to his ear, a souvenir from 1956, when a still exploded and sent shrapnel through his face, leaving tissue that looked like melted wax. Every morning, Lucas woke at 4 a.m. in the house his grandfather had built in 1921, made coffee in a percolator older than he was, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, while he planned operations that required the same level of coordination as military campaigns. He didn't talk much during those early hours, just sat in darkness, drank coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and thought about the business of staying free in a country that increasingly criminalized everything he believed in. He'd married Sarah Beth Malone in 1947, right after coming home from occupied Germany, where he'd served with the 82nd Airborne, jumped into Normandy on D-Day, seen things that still woke him screaming 32 years later. They'd had 3 sons. Cole was 30 now, built like his father with the same quiet intensity and obsessive attention to security. Travis was 27, bigger than Cole, stronger, with a philosophical bent that made him articulate the family's anti-government views in ways that sounded almost reasonable. Dalton was 24, the baby, arrested 3 weeks ago during the June 7th raid, currently sitting in federal custody, awaiting trial, on charges that carried 10 years in prison. Sarah was 54, a thin woman whose face showed every hard year, hands as rough as Lucas's, from decades of keeping a household running on income that couldn't be reported to any government agency. What Lucas valued most wasn't the money from Moonshine, though the operation grossed approximately $300,000 annually in 1979, enough to support 3 families comfortably. What he valued was freedom, independence, the knowledge that he lived by his own rules according to codes his ancestors had died defending. The Patterson family answered to God and conscience, not to federal agents who enforced laws that violated constitutional principles the Founding Fathers had established. His great-grandfather, Ezra Patterson, had fought for the Confederacy, survived the war, came home to mountains occupied by federal troops who treated Southern civilians like conquered enemies. Ezra had started making moonshine in 1889 as an act of resistance, refusing to pay federal taxes on alcohol, refusing to acknowledge government authority over what he did on his own property. That resistance had been passed father to son for 4 generations, becoming more than business, becoming identity, philosophy, religion, almost. The Patterson family represented something rare in 1979, America, a direct link to 18th century ideas about limited government and individual sovereignty, ideas that most of the country had abandoned, but that still burned bright in these mountains. Lucas had taught his sons that federal agents weren't lawmen, they were enforcers of tyranny, no different from British redcoats who'd tried to impose taxes on colonists in 1776. The Constitution guaranteed the right to bear arms, the right to property, the right to live free from government interference. Any law that violated those rights was illegitimate, null, and void, deserving of resistance. That's what Lucas believed with every fiber of his being. That's what he'd taught his sons. And that belief was about to cost 11 federal agents their lives. Cole James Patterson was 30 years old that summer. Though the lines around his eyes and the gray in his beard made him look closer to 40. He stood 6'2", broad through the shoulders from years of hauling equipment and working terrain. So steep you needed ropes to stay upright. His face was angular like his father's, with the same pale gray eyes that seemed to see through deception to truth underneath. He kept his brown hair cut short, his beard trimmed neat, and moved with careful precision that came from understanding that one mistake in their business meant federal prison or death. Every morning, Cole woke at 5 in the house he'd built on his father's property, made breakfast for his wife Jennifer and their 3 children, then spent his day either working the stills or maintaining security systems that had become increasingly sophisticated as federal pressure increased. Cole was methodical, patient, the kind of man who thought 10 steps ahead and prepared for contingencies nobody else considered. His father had taught him that successful moonshining required intelligence as much as skill, that the families who survived were those who stayed paranoid, who trusted nobody outside blood relations, who understood they were at war with a government that had unlimited resources and would never stop coming. Travis Wayne Patterson was 27, same height as Cole, but built thicker, stockier, with a barrel chest and arms like tree trunks. He had the Patterson features, the angular face, the intense eyes, but where Cole was quiet and calculating, Travis was philosophical, articulate, the family's spokesman when dealing with outsiders who didn't understand their worldview. Travis had attended community college for 2 years, studied history and political philosophy, could quote the founding fathers from memory, and construct elaborate arguments about constitutional rights and government tyranny that sounded almost reasonable until you remembered he was justifying felonies. A thick beard covered his face, brown with red highlights, and he wore his hair longer than his brother's, past his shoulders, a conscious rejection of mainstream society's expectations. Travis lived in a cabin he'd built himself on the Patterson property, spent his evenings reading about the Whiskey Rebellion and Ruby Ridge and Waco, events that hadn't happened yet in 1979, but that would later confirm everything Travis believed about government violence against citizens who refused to comply with tyrannical laws. He'd never married, said he wouldn't bring children into a world where federal agents could kick down your door and steal your property without consequences. Dalton Ray Patterson was 24, the youngest, standing 5'11", lean and rangy with nervous energy that made him seem younger than his years. He had lighter hair than his brothers, brown instead of the darker shade Cole and Travis shared, took after their mother's side in looks. Dalton had been the one arrested during the June 7th raid, caught at the still site when federal agents swarmed in with helicopters and assault weapons like they were taking down a terrorist cell instead of busting a moonshine operation. He'd been held without bail, federal prosecutors arguing he was a flight risk, currently sitting in a cell in Knoxville, awaiting trial scheduled for September. That arrest had radicalized Dalton in ways his father's teachings never quite accomplished, being treated like a dangerous criminal, being held in a cage, being processed through a system that didn't care about constitutional rights or mountain culture or family heritage, had transformed Dalton from reluctant participant in the family business into true believer in the family's anti-government philosophy. His letters from jail, which Cole and Travis had read multiple times, talked about tyranny and resistance, and the duty-free men had to fight oppression regardless of cost. Those letters terrified Sarah, who saw her baby boy being corrupted by rage. But they resonated with Lucas, who recognized his own younger self in Dalton's words. The Patterson family operation had grossed $300,000 in 1978, running 3 separate still sites, producing approximately 400 gallons weekly, selling to distributors across 3 states. That income supported 3 families, paid for equipment and supplies, and represented freedom from the wage slave existence most Americans accepted without question. But that operation had been destroyed on June 7, 1979, when 15 ATF agents conducted a coordinated raid on all 3 sites simultaneously, seizing equipment worth $180,000, arresting Dalton, and leaving Lucas with nothing except rage and a decision about whether to rebuild or retaliate. June 7, 1979, started as a normal Thursday for the Patterson family. Lucas had checked the main still site at dawn, confirmed everything was operating smoothly, returned home for breakfast with Sarah. Cole was working the secondary site near Fighting Creek, monitoring temperature and collecting product. Travis was handling distribution, meeting with buyers in Knoxville, maintaining the network that kept money flowing. Dalton was at the 3rd site, the newest operation tucked into a hollow so remote that Lucas had believed it was undetectable. All 3 sites were running, producing quality shine, generating income, operating the way they had for 90 years. Then at 9:47 a.m., helicopters appeared. 3 of them, Bell 206 Jet Rangers, ATF markings visible, flying low over the ridgeline, infrared cameras scanning for heat signatures that would indicate stills. Lucas saw them from his porch, understood immediately what was happening, grabbed his radio to warn his sons. Too late. The helicopters had already located all 3 sites, were directing ground teams in, 15 federal agents in tactical gear, swarming through the forest with assault rifles and search warrants and the full weight of government authority. Cole heard the helicopters, ran from the secondary site, escaped into forest before 8 agents arrived. Travis was in Knoxville, safe from immediate arrest, but helpless to stop what was happening. Dalton wasn't as lucky. He was at the newest site when agents burst through the trees, weapons raised, shouting commands to get on the ground, hands behind his head. Dalton had thought about running, thought about the hunting rifle leaning against a tree 20 feet away, thought about resistance. Then he'd seen the assault rifles, the body armor, the helicopters overhead, and understood that resistance meant death. He'd surrendered, been zip-tied, been read his rights while agents photographed everything, documented the still, began dismantling equipment that represented months of work and thousands of dollars in investment. By noon, all 3 Patterson sites had been raided. Federal agents seized 3 complete still systems worth approximately $80,000 total, 300 gallons of finished product, and arrested Dalton Patterson on charges of operating an illegal distillery, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Lucas stood on his porch watching helicopters fly away, carrying his youngest son toward federal custody, and felt something cold and final settle in his chest. This wasn't like previous raids where they'd lose some equipment but rebuild. This was total war, coordinated assault, government using military tactics against civilians who were just trying to make a living without paying taxes to a tyrannical system. That evening, Lucas called Cole and Travis to the house. Sarah stayed in the bedroom, not because she didn't know what was coming, but because she couldn't watch her husband and sons cross a line that terrified her. "They took everything," Lucas said. His voice was flat, empty. 3 sites, all our equipment, $180,000 in losses. They got Dalton. Federal prosecutors are talking 10 years in prison for a 24-year-old kid whose only crime was making whiskey his ancestors have been making for 90 years. Cole's jaw tightened. "We rebuild. We've rebuilt before." "Not this time," Lucas said. "This is different." They used helicopters, tactical teams, coordinated assault on 3 sites simultaneously. That takes planning, resources, intelligence we didn't know they had. They're not just enforcing laws anymore. They're waging war on us, on our way of life, on everything we believe in. Travis leaned forward. "So what do we do? Do we surrender? Do we let them win?" Lucas looked at his 2 sons, at the men he'd raised to value freedom and resistance above everything else, who'd learned from childhood that government authority was illegitimate when it violated natural rights. "We don't surrender," Lucas said quietly. "We fight back. Not against the law, against the men who enforce it, the agents who raided us, who arrested Dalton, who destroyed 90 years of family heritage. We make them understand that actions have consequences, that you can't come into these mountains, can't violate our property, can't steal from us without paying a price." The days following the June 7th raid were suffocating, not just from the Tennessee heat that climbed past 95 degrees, but from the weight of rage and helplessness that settled over the Patterson family. Dalton's arraignment was scheduled for June 15th. His court-appointed attorney, a young public defender from Knoxville who'd never handled Moonshine cases, called Lucas to explain that the federal government was seeking maximum penalties, that Dalton was facing 10 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. The attorney used words like mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines and federal prosecution's success rate that all meant the same thing. Dalton was going to prison for a decade because he'd been doing what Patterson men had done for 4 generations. Lucas hung up the phone, sat at his kitchen table, and made a list. Names, addresses, vehicle descriptions. The 15 ATF agents who'd participated in the raid had been identified through documents, served during Dalton's arrest. Lead agent was a man named Robert Hendricks, 42 years old, based in Knoxville, 15 years with the ATF. His team included agents from Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina, brought in specifically for this operation. Lucas wrote down everything he could learn about each agent, information gathered through contacts, through observation, through the kind of intelligence network that mountain people had always maintained to stay ahead of federal law enforcement. Cole and Travis watched their father compile this information, understanding what it meant, what he was planning. "Dad," Cole said carefully, on June 12th, 5 days after the raid. "You're talking about killing federal agents. That's not moonshining charges, that's capital murder. That's death penalty." "They destroyed us," Lucas said, without looking up from his list. "They took $180,000 in equipment we can't replace. They arrested your brother, who's going to spend his 20s and 30s in a federal cage. They did this knowing we're just mountain people trying to live free, knowing we weren't hurting anyone, knowing they were enforcing tyrannical laws our founding fathers would have rebelled against. So yes, I'm talking about consequences. I'm talking about making sure every federal agent in Tennessee understands that raiding Patterson property means dying." Travis spoke quietly. "That's war, Dad. That's not defending property. That's declaring war on the federal government." Lucas finally looked up, met his son's eyes. "We've been at war since 1791, since the Whiskey Rebellion. We just forgot that while they kept building their power. Time we remembered, time we reminded them that free men don't accept tyranny quietly." The June 15th arraignment happened without Patterson family present. Dalton appeared in federal court, pleaded not guilty, was denied bail, and returned to his cell. The public defender called Lucas afterwards to report that federal prosecutors had offered a plea deal, plead guilty to reduced charges, serve 5 years instead of 10. Lucas told the attorney to inform Dalton to reject the deal, to fight every charge, to make the government prove their case in court. The attorney stammered something about how federal conviction rates exceeded 90%, how fighting charges usually resulted in harsher sentences, how 5 years was actually a good deal given the evidence. Lucas hung up on him. That evening, Lucas gathered his sons again. Same kitchen table where they'd made every important Patterson family decision for 58 years. "I've identified the agents responsible," Lucas said. 15 names, but we're focusing on the core team. Robert Hendricks, the lead agent. His second in command, James Mitchell. The pilot who flew the helicopter, Michael Carson. The agents who actually put hands on Dalton, who zip-tied him, who took him into custody. 11 men total who bear direct responsibility for destroying our family. Cole's hands were shaking. "Dad, you're talking about murder. Multiple murders. Federal agents. The government will never stop hunting us. They'll execute us." Lucas nodded slowly. "Probably. But they'll remember that enforcing tyranny has a cost. They'll think twice before raiding another mountain family. And Dalton will see that his father and brothers didn't abandon him, didn't accept his imprisonment quietly." On June 20th, 13 days after the raid, Lucas drove to Knoxville and found Robert Hendricks at a gas station near the ATF field office. Lucas didn't approach him, didn't make contact, just watched from across the street, studying the man who'd led the raid that destroyed his family. Hendricks was 42 years old, average height, average build, Nothing physically distinctive except for the confidence he carried, the casual arrogance of a man who believed he was on the right side of law and morality. He pumped gas into his government-issued Ford sedan, went inside to pay, came back out talking on what looked like one of those new portable phones Lucas had seen advertised but never used. Hendricks looked relaxed, unbothered, probably saw the Patterson raid as just another successful operation, just another day at work enforcing laws he believed were legitimate. Lucas watched him drive away and felt cold hatred crystallize into certainty. This man had no understanding of what he'd done, no comprehension of the codes he'd violated, no fear of consequences. That was about to change. Lucas followed Hendricks for 3 days, learning his patterns, his routes, where he lived, where he ate lunch, where he stopped for coffee every morning at 7:30, gathering intelligence the way he'd learned in the 82nd Airborne, the way he'd taught his sons to watch federal agents without being detected. On June 23rd, Lucas called his sons to the barn behind his house. The structure was old, built in 1921, same year as the house, used for storage now that they didn't keep livestock anymore. Inside, Lucas had spread out maps of Sevier County, marked with locations and times and routes. He'd also assembled weapons, more weapons than Cole had seen outside a gun store. 4 hunting rifles, 3 shotguns, 2 handguns, boxes of ammunition stacked on a workbench. "This is what we're doing," Lucas said without preamble. "June 28th, 9 days from now, we're going to eliminate the agents responsible for destroying our family. Not in our holler, not on our property, where we'd be defendable. We're going after them in Knoxville, on federal ground, making a statement that they're not safe anywhere." Cole and Travis stared at their father, at this man they'd respected their entire lives, who was now proposing something that crossed every legal and moral boundary. Travis spoke first. "Dad, I understand your rage. I feel it too. But killing federal agents won't free Dalton, won't restore our equipment, won't accomplish anything except guaranteeing we die in prison or get executed." Lucas met his son's eyes. "It'll accomplish something more important than any of that. It'll prove that Americans still exist who won't accept tyranny quietly, who remember what the Founding Fathers taught us about resisting government overreach. Our ancestors fought the British over taxes on tea. We're fighting federal agents over taxes on whiskey. Same principle, same righteousness." Cole's voice was quiet, strained. "You're asking us to become murderers, executioners. We're not law enforcement. We're not soldiers following orders. We're just moonshiners who got raided." Lucas shook his head. "We're patriots who got attacked by federal tyranny. And when government becomes destructive of the rights it was created to protect, it's not just our right but our duty to resist. That's in the Declaration of Independence. That's what our ancestors believed when they created this country. We've forgotten those principles, gotten soft, accepted laws we should be fighting. The raid on June 7th was the government telling us they own us, they control us, we have no rights, they're bound to respect. I'm telling them they're wrong. We're free men. We bow to God and conscience, not to federal agents enforcing unconstitutional laws." The 3 Patterson men stood in that barn, surrounded by weapons and maps. making a decision that would define the rest of their lives and mark Tennessee history forever. Cole looked at Travis. Travis looked at their father. Outside, June heat shimmered off the mountains. Birds sang. Insects buzzed. Normal life continuing, while three men planned mass murder, disguised as patriotic resistance. Finally, Cole nodded. "I'm with you, Dad. God help us, I'm with you." Travis took longer, but eventually his head dipped in agreement. For Dalton, for family, for freedom, however twisted that word had become. The preparation took 8 days, from June 20th to June 28th, methodical and careful, Lucas applying military precision to planning an assault on federal agents. They met every evening after dark in Lucas's barn, never the same time twice, varying patterns to avoid detection if anyone was watching. Lucas had served in the 82nd Airborne, jumped into Normandy, survived combat in France and Germany, understood small unit tactics and coordination. Cole had been in the National Guard for 4 years in the early 1970s, had learned weapons handling and basic infantry operations. Travis had no military experience but had studied guerrilla warfare, had read about the Viet Cong and Afghan Mujahideen and other insurgent groups that had fought superior forces through asymmetric tactics. Together they planned the operation because that's what it was, a military assault on what Lucas considered an occupying force. The arsenal was assembled piece by piece. Lucas's Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, his primary hunting rifle for 30 years, Cole's Remington 700 in 308, accurate to 800 yards with a decent scope. Travis's Marlin 336 lever action in 30-30, faster firing rate for close work. Lucas also retrieved his Colt 1911 .45 pistol from World War II, still functional after 35 years, and 2 Remington 870 shotguns, 12 gauge, devastating at close range, 7 firearms for 3 men, enough firepower to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Ammunition was purchased carefully, spread across 8 different stores in 4 counties, never more than 2 boxes at any location, paid for in cash, avoiding patterns, 6 boxes of 30-06, 5 boxes of 308, 4 boxes of 30-30, 3 boxes of 45 ACP, 8 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot. Lucas kept receipts in a coffee can, documentation that would later be used as evidence of premeditation, proof that this wasn't spontaneous rage, but calculated murder. They also acquired other materials. Gasoline in 5-gallon cans, purchased from different stations. Road flares that could be used as improvised incendiaries. A police scanner to monitor law enforcement frequencies. Topographic maps of Sevier County and Knoxville. Binoculars, flashlights, rope, duct tape, supplies that could have innocent explanations individually, but together painted a picture of men preparing for sustained operations against human targets. Lucas spread maps across his kitchen table on June 24th, marked locations where federal agents would be vulnerable. The ATF field office in Knoxville was too secure, too many agents, too much potential for massive casualties and civilian involvement, but the agents' homes, their regular routes, the motel where out-of-town agents stayed during operations, those were soft targets. Lucas marked 3 primary locations: Highway 321 between Gatlinburg and Knoxville, where Robert Hendricks drove every morning, the Sleep Inn, where 6 agents were staying, and Chapman Highway, where 2 more agents lived in an apartment complex. They didn't discuss what they were planning in explicit terms, but unlike previous Patterson planning sessions for Moonshine operations, this time they couldn't avoid the reality. Cole finally said it on June 26th. "We're going to kill federal agents. Execute them. That's premeditated murder. Federal capital offense. They'll hunt us forever. They'll execute us if they catch us." Lucas didn't flinch. Yes, all of that's true. But some things matter more than survival. Freedom matters more. Resistance to tyranny matters more. Making sure the government understands they can't attack mountain families without consequences matters more. We do this, we probably die. But we die as free men who fought back. Travis added quietly, and every federal agent in Tennessee will remember what happened to the ones who raided the Pattersons. They'll think twice before kicking down another door, before seizing another. Still, before imprisoning another mountain man for refusing to pay taxes our ancestors would have rebelled against. That deterrent is worth dying for. The 3 men stood there in Lucas's barn, weapons and maps surrounding them, understanding they were about to cross a line that separated legitimate grievance from domestic terrorism, that separated mountain justice from mass murder, understanding and choosing it anyway. On June 27th, they gathered one final time. "Tomorrow night," Lucas said, "we move at 10:52 p.m. We hit 3 locations simultaneously. No mercy, no hesitation, no survivors. Federal tyranny ends tomorrow for 11 agents." The temperature had dropped to 71 degrees by the time the Patterson men gathered at the base of Chapman Highway, but the humidity remained oppressive, the air thick with moisture that made breathing feel like drowning. No moon tonight, just stars obscured by clouds. Darkness so complete that Lucas could barely see his sons standing 5 feet away. They'd parked Lucas's 1975 Ford F-150 and Cole's 1977 Chevy pickup on an abandoned logging road, pulled off into tree cover, disabled the dome lights so opening doors wouldn't advertise their presence. Lucas stood outside his truck, Winchester Model 70 heavy in his hands, waiting for his breathing to steady, for his heart to stop hammering against his ribs. He'd expected the same cold focus he'd felt before combat jumps in World War II. The emptiness that let you do terrible things without thinking. Instead, he felt something between terror and exhilaration, understanding that in the next few hours, he was about to become either a patriot or a domestic terrorist, depending on who wrote the history. Cole checked his Remington 700 for the 5th time, confirming the scope was zeroed. The magazine was loaded with 5 rounds of .308. His face showed nothing, carefully blank, but Lucas could see his oldest son's hands trembling slightly as he chambered around. Cole had never killed anyone, had spent his National Guard years during peacetime doing training exercises, never expected to use military skills for anything like this. Travis had wild energy about him, pacing in tight circles, breathing too fast, gripping his Marlin 336 like it was the only solid thing in a world that had gone mad. Travis was the philosopher, the one who'd articulated justifications for what they were about to do, who'd framed it as resistance to tyranny rather than murder. But philosophy looked different when you were holding a rifle and preparing to hunt human beings. "Dad," Travis said quietly, "once we do this, there's no going back. No redemption, no forgiveness. We become what the government says we are. Terrorists? Murderers?" Lucas looked at his sons, these men he'd raised, whose lives he was about to destroy. "You're right. We cross this line, we're damned. But we're already damned by living in a country that's forgotten what freedom means, that's accepted tyranny as normal. At least we'll be damned on our own terms." They moved through the darkness toward their first target, Highway 321, the route Robert Hendricks drove every morning at 7:30. But they weren't waiting until morning. Intelligence gathered over 2 weeks had revealed that Hendricks often drove this route late at night, returning from meetings in Gatlinburg, driving alone in his government sedan. Lucas had confirmed Hendricks was at a meeting tonight, would be driving home between 11 o'clock and 11:30 p.m. The ambush site was perfect, a curve in the road surrounded by forest, no houses nearby, no witnesses. At 10:52 p.m., they reached the position Lucas had scouted. A blind 20 yards off the road, elevated position giving clear line of sight for 200 yards in both directions. They settled in, rifles ready, waiting. The night pressed down on them, insects screaming in the humidity, occasional car passing without knowing 3 armed men watched from darkness. Cole lay prone with his Remington, scope trained on the road. Travis knelt beside a tree, Marlin ready for backup. Lucas stood behind them, Winchester in hand, scanning for complications. At 11:17 p.m., headlights appeared from the Gatlinburg direction, vehicle moving at normal speed. Lucas raised binoculars, confirmed it was Hendricks's government Ford, confirmed the driver matched Hendricks's profile. One man, alone, completely unaware he was about to die. "This is it," Lucas whispered. "Cole, you take the shot. Disable the vehicle, then we move in." Cole's breathing steadied, the discipline of hundreds of hours of target practice taking over. He centered the crosshairs on the driver's side windshield, led the target slightly to account for movement, exhaled slowly. The Remington cracked once, impossibly loud in the June night. The government sedan swerved, hit the guardrail, came to rest, half on the road, half in the ditch. Steam rose from under the hood. The Patterson men moved. They approached the wrecked sedan from 3 directions, rifles ready, moving with coordinated precision that came from planning and military training. The vehicle sat at an angle, driver's side against the guardrail, passenger side exposed. Steam poured from under the hood, where Cole's .308 round had punched through the radiator and engine block. The windshield was shattered, spiderwebbed from impact. Lucas reached the driver's door first, yanked it open. Robert Hendricks sat slumped over the steering wheel, bleeding from cuts caused by flying glass, dazed but conscious, trying to reach for the service weapon, holstered under his jacket. Lucas grabbed Hendricks's gun hand, twisted it away, pulled the agent from the vehicle. Hendricks hit the pavement hard, groaned, tried to get up. Lucas put a boot on his chest, pressed him down, Winchester aimed at his face. "Robert Hendricks," Lucas said, voice flat, empty. "You led the raid on my property, June 7th. You arrested my son. You destroyed 90 years of Patterson family heritage." Hendricks focused on Lucas, recognition dawning through pain and shock. "Patterson. Jesus Christ, you're Lucas Patterson. What the hell are you doing?" "What you should have expected," Lucas said. "Federal tyranny has consequences. You can't raid mountain families, can't steal property, can't imprison people for exercising constitutional rights without someone fighting back." Hendricks tried to sit up. Lucas pressed harder with his boot. "This is insane. I was doing my job. Enforcing federal law." "You're going to prison for this, Patterson? Life sentence, maybe death penalty. You're destroying your family over Moonshine. Your job is enforcing tyranny," Lucas said. "Following orders isn't justification. Nazis followed orders. Soviet secret police followed orders. You're no different, just another government agent oppressing citizens who want to live free." Hendricks's face showed anger breaking through shock. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer. You kill me, you're declaring war on the United States government." "Already at war," Lucas said. "Have been since you came into my mountains with helicopters and assault rifles, treating me like a criminal for making whiskey my ancestors made legally for 150 years. Cole and Travis stood watching this exchange, rifles ready, scanning for other vehicles. Travis spoke quietly. "Dad, we need to move. Someone might have heard the shot, might come investigating." Lucas nodded. He looked at Hendricks one more time, saw a man who genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong, who saw moonshining as serious crime rather than cultural tradition, who would never understand the Patterson worldview, even if given hours to explain it. That fundamental disconnect, that inability to bridge the gap between government authority and mountain independence, that's what made violence inevitable. Some conflicts couldn't be resolved through dialogue. Some differences ran too deep. Lucas raised his Winchester, aimed at Hendricks's chest. The agent's eyes went wide. "Wait. Please, I got a wife. 2 kids in college. You don't have to do this. We can work something out." "We can," Lucas said, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across Highway 321, fading into June darkness. Robert Hendricks, 42 years old, 15 years with the ATF, died on the pavement beside his government vehicle, killed by a man who believed he was resisting tyranny and executed an agent who believed he was enforcing legitimate law. Both men convinced they were right, both following codes they believed justified their actions. But only one would face judgment, because the survivor writes history and the dead become either martyrs or villains, depending on whose story gets told. Lucas stood over Hendricks's body, waiting for guilt or horror or regret. Felt only cold satisfaction that one of the 11 agents responsible for destroying his family had been held accountable. Cole and Travis looked at their father, at this man who just executed a federal agent in cold blood, at someone they recognized and didn't recognize simultaneously. "Dad," Cole said quietly, "that's murder. That's not defense, not resistance. That's just killing a man who was following orders." Lucas turned to his sons. orders to enforce tyranny, orders to violate constitutional rights, orders that our founding fathers would have rebelled against. If following orders made Hendricks innocent, then every oppressor in history was innocent. But they're not. They're guilty, and guilt demands consequences. Cole wanted to argue, wanted to explain that this logic justified atrocities, that believing you're right doesn't make you right. But they were already too far past the line for philosophy. They'd killed a federal agent. 10 more to go. They left Hendricks's body on Highway 321 and drove toward Knoxville. 3 men in 2 trucks, weapons loaded, committed now to finishing what they'd started. The sleep-in on Chapman Highway housed 6 ATF agents who'd participated in the June 7th raid. Agents from Georgia and North Carolina brought in specifically for the multi-site operation. Lucas had confirmed their locations. Through observation, had watched them come and go for 2 weeks, had noted that they parked in a cluster near their rooms, that they didn't vary routines, that they treated Knoxville like safe territory where they didn't need to maintain security protocols. Federal arrogance, Lucas thought. Believing their badges protected them, believing mountain people they'd oppressed wouldn't fight back. At 12:47 a.m. on June 29th, the Patterson men pulled into the sleep-in parking lot. The motel was typical budget accommodation, 2-story structure, exterior corridors, parking directly in front of rooms. 6 federal vehicles were parked in spaces 217 through 222, government plates clearly visible. Lucas counted vehicles, confirmed all 6 agents were present. Cole and Travis waited in the trucks while Lucas walked through the parking lot, placing improvised incendiaries under each vehicle, road flares, modified with gasoline-soaked rags, simple but effective. If agents tried to flee, their vehicles would be unusable, forcing them into the open where rifles could engage. At 12:52 a.m., Lucas returned to his truck, looked at his sons. We do this fast, coordinated, overwhelming force. Travis, you take rooms 217 and 218 on the ground floor. Cole, 219 and 220, also ground floor. I'll handle 221 and 222 on the second floor. We breach simultaneously at 1 o'clock a.m. exactly. Anyone who resists, anyone who reaches for weapons, anyone who tries to run, we eliminate them. These men destroyed our family. They don't deserve mercy. They wouldn't show us. The 3 men synchronized watches, checked weapons, moved into position. Lucas climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor, positioned himself outside room 221. Through the thin door he could hear television, late-night talk show, someone laughing at jokes. Normal life, ordinary evening. Federal agent relaxing in a motel room. Completely unaware, 3 armed men were about to breach his door and execute him for enforcing laws he believed were legitimate. At 1 o'clock a.m., exactly, Lucas kicked the door. The cheap lock failed immediately. He burst into the room, shotgun raised. The agent inside, a man whose name Lucas would later learn was James Mitchell, was sitting on the bed in boxer shorts and a t-shirt, watching television, eating fast food. He saw Lucas, saw the shotgun, threw his hands up. "Don't shoot! Jesus Christ, don't shoot! I'm unarmed." Lucas hesitated for maybe 2 seconds. seeing a man who looked terrified and vulnerable, who was just doing his job, who probably had family waiting for him back in Georgia. Then Lucas thought about Dalton, sitting in a federal cell, facing 10 years. Thought about $180,000 in destroyed equipment. Thought about 90 years of Patterson heritage, eliminated by federal tyranny. He fired twice. James Mitchell fell backward across the bed, dead before his body stopped moving. Down the corridor, Travis had breached room 217, found 2 agents playing cards, eliminated both before they could reach weapons on the nightstand. Cole breached 219, found 1 agent in the shower, 1 sleeping, killed both efficiently. Lucas moved to room 222, kicked the door, found it empty, moved back down, helped his sons clear remaining rooms. 6 federal agents dead in less than 3 minutes, killed in their motel rooms while off duty, relaxing, believing they were safe. The television in room 221 still played, audience laughter echoing through a room that now contained a corpse and the smell of gunpowder and death. Lucas, Cole, and Travis regrouped in the parking lot. They ignited the incendiaries under the federal vehicles, watched flames spread, heard gas tanks ignite with dull whumps. 6 vehicles burning, 6 bodies cooling in motel rooms, 6 families who'd wake up tomorrow to news that would destroy them. Travis was shaking, Marlin hanging loose in his hands, face pale in the orange glow of burning vehicles. "Dad, what have we done? What the hell have we done?" "We've sent a message," Lucas said. "Federal tyranny has consequences. Every agent in Tennessee will know what happens when you raid Patterson property." Cole looked sick, leaning against his truck, breathing hard, like he might vomit. Those men weren't armed, weren't prepared. We just executed them. "They destroyed our family," Lucas said. "They got what they deserved," but even as he said it, Lucas felt something crack inside him, some essential piece of his humanity breaking under the weight of what he'd just done. 7 federal agents, dead, 4 more to go, and no going back. They left the sleep-in burning, 6 federal vehicles engulfed in flames, 6 bodies in rooms that would be discovered within hours. Lucas drove east on Chapman Highway toward the apartment complex where 2 more agents lived, men whose names were Michael Carson and David Wu, the helicopter pilot, and his co-pilot from the June 7th raid. Carson lived in Unit 4B, Wu in 4C, adjacent apartments in a complex that housed mostly young professionals and college students. Lucas had confirmed their schedules, knew they worked irregular hours, knew they'd both be home tonight based on vehicles in the parking lot. At 1:47 a.m., the Patterson men pulled into the apartment complex, parked away from exterior lights, approached Building 4 on foot. The complex was quiet, most residents asleep, a few windows showing television glow. Lucas led his sons up exterior stairs to the 4th floor, positioned them outside both target apartments. Travis took 4B, Lucas and Cole took 4C. They'd breach simultaneously, eliminate targets, extract before anyone could respond. But when Travis tried the door to 4B, it opened. Unlocked. Interior dark, except for light spilling from what looked like a bedroom. Travis entered carefully, shotgun ready, cleared the living room, moved toward the bedroom, found Michael Carson asleep, alone, completely vulnerable. Travis stood there for a long moment, looking at a man who couldn't have been older than 35, who'd flown a helicopter during a raid, who probably saw himself as a professional doing legitimate work. Carson stirred, sensed presence, opened his eyes, saw Travis standing over him with a shotgun, froze. "Don't move," Travis said. "Hands where I can see them." Carson's hands came up slowly, empty, shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Patterson," Travis said. "You flew the helicopter June 7th. You helped raid our property." "I was just doing my job," Carson said, voice breaking. "I'm a pilot. I fly where they tell me. I don't make decisions about who to raid." "Following orders," Travis said. "That's what you all say. Nazis followed orders, didn't make them innocent." Carson's face showed genuine fear now. "Please, I got a girlfriend. We're getting married in August. I never hurt nobody, just flew a helicopter." "You enabled tyranny," Travis said. "Made the raid possible. That makes you guilty." The shotgun roared once. Michael Carson died in his own bed, killed for flying a helicopter, for following orders, for being part of a system that Travis Patterson believed was fundamentally illegitimate. Travis stood there, shotgun smoking, looking at what he'd done, feeling nothing and everything simultaneously. Outside, Cole had breached 4C, found David Wu watching late-night television, eliminated him with 2 shots from his Remington. They regrouped in the hallway, 8 dead. 3 more targets remained on Lucas's list. The 9th target lived in a house on the north side of Knoxville, an agent named Thomas Bradley who'd been part of the ground team that arrested Dalton. Lucas had watched Bradley's routine for a week, knew he lived alone, knew his house was isolated enough that gunshots wouldn't immediately draw attention. At 2:38 a.m., they arrived at Bradley's house, a small ranch-style structure on a half-acre lot. Bradley's truck was in the driveway, lights off inside. Lucas approached the front door, tried it. Locked. He circled to the back, found a sliding glass door, used a pry bar to force it open. The sound of breaking glass was loud in the June night. Inside the house, they heard movement, someone waking, voice calling out, asking who's there. Bradley appeared in the hallway, weapon drawn, service pistol aimed at Lucas. "Federal agent," Bradley shouted. "Drop your weapon. Now." Lucas dove sideways, shotgun roaring, buckshot tearing through drywall. Bradley returned fire, 3 quick shots, bullets punching holes in walls, shattering a window. Cole came through the front door, flanking Bradley's position, fired his Remington once. Bradley went down hard, pistol clattering across hardwood floor. 9 federal agents dead in 5 hours. Cole Patterson stood in Thomas Bradley's hallway at 2:52 a.m., Remington still raised, staring at the body of a federal agent who died defending his own home from intruders. This one was different from the others. Bradley had been armed, had fired back, had given them something closer to a gunfight. But that distinction meant nothing because they'd broken into his house, had hunted him down specifically, had given him no choice but to fight or die. Cole's hands started shaking violently, rifle slipping from his grip, clattering to the floor. He backed against the wall, slid down to sitting position, put his face in his hands. "Dad," Cole whispered, "we're murderers, not patriots, not resistance fighters. Just murderers who broke into people's homes and killed them." Lucas stood over Bradley's body, shotgun still smoking, face showing cracks in the certainty that had carried him this far. "We're defending freedom," Lucas said. But his voice lacked conviction. Even Lucas was starting to understand the magnitude of what they'd become. "Freedom," Cole said, voice breaking. "We've killed 9 federal agents. Men with families, with lives, with futures. Men who were just doing their jobs. And we killed them. In their homes, in their beds, while they were unarmed and vulnerable. That's not defense, that's terrorism." Travis appeared in the doorway, face pale, marlin hanging loose in his hands. "I killed a man who was sleeping," Travis said quietly. "Shot him in his own bed. He begged for his life, told me he was getting married. I killed him anyway because Dad said following orders makes him guilty. But if following orders is guilt, what does that make us? We're following Dad's orders. Does that make us innocent?" Lucas looked at his sons, these men he'd raised to value freedom above everything, who'd followed him into darkness, because that's what Mountain Sons did, who were now breaking under the weight of 9 murders. "We draw the line here," Lucas said. 2 agents remain on the list. One's a woman, Patricia Chen. One has young children at home, Richard Foster. We don't touch them. We violated enough codes tonight." Travis stared at his father. "So 9 dead federal agents is justice, but 11 is too much? Where's the line, Dad? When did you decide 9 murders were acceptable, but not 11? What's the moral calculation that makes that math work?" Lucas had no answer, because there was no answer. The truth was they'd crossed every moral and legal boundary hours ago, and stopping at 9 instead of 11 didn't redeem anything, didn't make them less guilty, didn't transform murder into justified resistance. It just meant 2 federal agents would survive to testify, to help prosecutors build cases that would send the Pattersons to death row. They left Bradley's house at 3:15 a.m. 3 men covered in gunpowder residue and guilt, driving through Knoxville streets toward home. The radio played country music, normal programming, completely unaware that the deadliest attack on federal law enforcement in American history had just occurred. Cole drove in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white, seeing Thomas Bradley's face every time he closed his eyes. Travis sat in the passenger seat, staring at nothing, replaying Michael Carson's last words about getting married, about never hurting nobody. Lucas followed in his truck, alone with thoughts that were starting to look like regret, like horror, like understanding that he'd destroyed his family more completely than any federal raid ever could. At 4:47 a.m., they reached the Patterson property. Sarah was waiting on the porch, had been waiting all night, knowing what her husband and sons had gone to do. She saw their faces, saw the blood on Lucas's shirt, understood immediately. "How many?" Sarah asked. Lucas couldn't meet her eyes. 9. Federal agents. We killed 9 men tonight. Sarah's hand went to her mouth, tears starting. "Oh God, Lucas, what have you done?" "What I had to do," Lucas said. But even he didn't believe it anymore. The first 911 call came at 5:23 a.m. from a motel guest at the Sleep Inn who smelled smoke, looked outside, saw 6 vehicles burning in the parking lot. The second call came at 5:31 when a motel employee checked on rooms that hadn't responded to fire alarm, found 6 bodies. By 6 a.m., the Knoxville Police Department, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and FBI had descended on what would become the largest crime scene in Tennessee history. What they found exceeded every nightmare scenario law enforcement had confronted. Special Agent in Charge Robert Morrison arrived from the FBI's Memphis field office at 7:15 a.m., took one look at the carnage at the Sleep Inn, and understood this wasn't random violence or gang activity. This was targeted assassination of federal agents, systematic elimination, terrorism. Morrison was 51 years old, 24 years with the Bureau, had investigated bombings and kidnappings and organized crime. But standing in that motel parking lot, looking at 6 rooms where agents had been executed while off duty, he felt his understanding of domestic threats fundamentally shift. The bodies were everywhere. 6 in motel rooms, all shot multiple times at close range. Robert Hendricks on Highway 321 killed in his vehicle, Michael Carson and David Wu in their apartments, Thomas Bradley in his house, evidence of a firefight, bullet holes in walls. 9 federal agents dead in locations across Sevier County and Knoxville, killed in a coordinated assault that suggested military planning and ruthless execution. Tennessee, Bureau of Investigation Director Frank Coleman arrived at 8:30 a.m., established command center at the Knoxville FBI field office, began coordinating what would become the largest manhunt in Tennessee history. Coleman was 48 years old, 22 years in law enforcement, understood mountain culture better than most federal agents because he'd grown up in Appalachia. He looked at crime scene reports, studied the pattern, understood immediately who was responsible and why. "This is the Patterson family," Coleman told Morrison. "Lucas Patterson and his sons. They're retaliating for the June 7th Moonshine raid." Morrison studied the case file Coleman provided. ATF raided 3 Patterson still sites 3 weeks ago, arrested the youngest son Dalton, seized $180,000 in equipment. "You're saying they killed 9 federal agents over a moonshine bust?" Coleman nodded. "In their minds, it's not about moonshine. It's about federal tyranny, about government overreach, about defending property and freedom. Lucas Patterson is 56 years old, World War II veteran, 3rd-generation moonshiner. He's been raised on stories about revenue agents getting shot at, about mountain families defending themselves from federal interference. This attack is his version of the Whiskey Rebellion." Morrison felt cold fury settle in his gut. "Then we're declaring war on domestic terrorism. Full resources, every agent we can spare. The Pattersons don't get to become folk heroes. They don't get to hide in these mountains. We bring them in dead or alive." By 9:00 a.m., roadblocks were established on every major route out of Sevier County. Helicopters with infrared cameras were deployed to search the mountains. A task force of 75 federal agents was assembled, coordinating with state and local law enforcement. The Patterson property was under surveillance, agents watching from distance, waiting for warrants, preparing for what might become a standoff or shootout. At 10:15 a.m., a warrant was issued for Lucas, Cole, and Travis Patterson. 9 counts of first-degree murder of federal officers, conspiracy, weapons violations, domestic terrorism. The warrant authorized deadly force, meaning agents could shoot on sight if Patterson showed resistance. Morrison held a press conference at 11 o'clock a.m., standing in front of cameras with Coleman beside him, delivering the news that would dominate national headlines for weeks. 9 federal agents were killed last night in a coordinated terrorist attack across 3 locations. We have identified the suspects as Lucas Patterson and his 2 sons. They are considered armed and extremely dangerous. A $500,000 reward is offered for information leading to their capture. These men have declared war on the United States government. We will respond with overwhelming force. Behind Morrison, television screens showed photos of Lucas, Cole, and Travis Patterson. Mountain men with beards and hard eyes, looking exactly like the stereotype of Appalachian resistance to federal authority. The manhunt had begun. Lucas Patterson sat at his kitchen table on the morning of June 29th, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, listening to radio reports that described him as a domestic terrorist, a mass murderer, the most wanted man in America. Sarah sat across from him, crying quietly, understanding that her husband and sons would never be free again, that their family had been destroyed by decisions made in rage and justified through twisted logic about tyranny and resistance. Cole and Travis were in the barn, cleaning weapons, preparing for what they all knew was coming. The FBI would come. They'd come with overwhelming force, with helicopters and tactical teams and a determination to make examples of mountain men who'd killed federal agents. The question wasn't if, but when. At 2:47 p.m. on June 29th, 15 hours after the last murder, the FBI began their approach. 75 agents, state police backup, tactical teams in full gear, surrounding the Patterson property from all directions. Helicopters overhead, snipers positioned on ridge lines, armored vehicles blocking the driveway. Special Agent Morrison used a bullhorn from 300 yards away. Lucas Patterson, this is the FBI. You and your sons are wanted for the murder of 9 federal agents. You have 1 hour to surrender peacefully. Come out unarmed, hands visible. You will not be harmed if you comply. Resist, and we will use deadly force. Lucas stood on his porch, looking at the overwhelming federal presence, at helicopters and armored vehicles and enough firepower to level his property. He'd known this moment was coming, had prepared for it mentally if not practically. Beside him, Cole and Travis emerged from the barn, unarmed, faces showing resignation. "Dad," Cole said quietly, "we can't fight this. There's too many. We surrender. Maybe we live long enough to explain why we did it." Travis nodded. "We made our point. 9 dead agents means every federal law enforcement officer in America knows mountain people will fight back against tyranny. We don't need to die here." Lucas looked at his sons, at men he'd led into darkness, who'd followed him into mass murder because he'd convinced them it was righteous resistance. "I'm sorry," Lucas said, voice breaking. "I'm sorry I did this to you. I'm sorry I destroyed our family over rage and pride and twisted principles that sounded right until we put them into practice. You were just boys following your father. The guilt is mine." Sarah appeared in the doorway, put her hand on Lucas's shoulder. "End this," she said. "Don't make them kill you. Don't make your sons watch you die. We've lost enough." At 3:15 p.m., Lucas Patterson raised his hands, stepped off his porch, walked slowly toward the FBI perimeter. Behind him, Cole and Travis followed, also unarmed, also surrendering. No final shootout, no martyrdom, no dramatic last stand. Just 3 men accepting consequences for murders they could no longer justify, even to themselves. Federal agents swarmed them, forced them to the ground, zip-tied their hands, raid them their rights. Lucas looked up at Agent Morrison standing over him. "You killed 9 of my people," Morrison said, voice cold as stone. 9 good men who were just doing their jobs. You murdered them because you're too arrogant to accept that laws apply to you. Lucas met his eyes. They enforced tyranny. They violated constitutional rights. They got what they deserved. Morrison shook his head. "No, Mr. Patterson. They got murdered by a terrorist who dressed up his crimes in patriotic language. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison, or more likely, you're going to get executed. Either way, your family's legacy ends today." As agents loaded the 3 Patterson men into separate vehicles, Sarah stood on the porch, watching, same as Carol Harlow had watched, same as Elizabeth Morgan had watched, same as every mountain woman who'd seen her family destroyed by violence disguised as honor. The Patterson property, home to 4 generations, site of 90 years of moonshining tradition, was now a crime scene, would be seized by the federal government, would become another empty piece of land where nothing grew right because blood had soaked too deep into soil that remembers violence long after humans forget. The trial of Lucas Patterson and his 2 sons began in January 1980 in a federal courthouse in Nashville, Tennessee. The venue had been moved from Knoxville after defense attorneys successfully argued that finding an impartial jury was impossible in a city still traumatized by the June massacre. 27 combined charges of first-degree murder of federal officers, conspiracy, weapons violations, and domestic terrorism under statutes that had rarely been used. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. Forensic links between Patterson weapons and bullets recovered from victims' bodies, witness testimony from surviving agents Patricia Chen and Richard Foster, tire tracks and fingerprints at multiple crime scenes, and most damning, the Pattersons' own partial confessions. Lucas had told Agent Morrison the victims deserved what they got. Cole had admitted being present at multiple locations. Travis had written letters from jail, explaining his anti-government philosophy in detail that prosecutors used to establish motive and premeditation. The evidence was so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable from opening statements. The defense, 3 federal public defenders who looked defeated before jury selection finished, attempted to argue extreme emotional disturbance brought on by unlawful federal raid and systematic government persecution of mountain families. They painted a picture of men driven to desperate acts by tyrannical enforcement of unconstitutional laws, by theft of property through government seizure, by imprisonment of a son for exercising traditional rights. They brought in constitutional scholars who explained Founding Fathers' views on limited government and resistance to tyranny. They brought in historians who testified about the Whiskey Rebellion and long tradition of mountain resistance to federal authority. They brought in psychiatrists who spoke about Lucas's PTSD from World War II, about how trauma combined with rage could create situations where violence seemed justified. The prosecution destroyed these arguments systematically. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Reynolds was 46 years old, had prosecuted domestic terrorism cases across the Southeast for 15 years, specialized in dismantling ideological justifications violent men use to excuse atrocities. Constitutional rights don't include the right to murder federal agents, Reynolds told the jury during closing arguments. The Founding Fathers created a system of laws and courts precisely to prevent vigilante justice. These defendants didn't resist tyranny. They committed premeditated murder of 9 men who were enforcing legitimate federal laws. They hunted agents down in their homes, in motel rooms, while they slept. They shot men who begged for their lives. They planned this for weeks, purchased weapons and ammunition, coordinated attacks across multiple locations. This isn't resistance to tyranny. This is domestic terrorism, pure and simple. The only appropriate verdict is guilty on all counts. The jury, 12 people from Nashville who understood rural culture but hadn't lived mountain isolation, deliberated for 19 hours over 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty, all charges, all 3 defendants. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison, 58 years old, 16 years on the bench, looked at Lucas Patterson, at Cole and Travis, at men who showed varying degrees of remorse, but maintained they'd been defending freedom. Your actions represent the most serious attack on federal law enforcement in American history, Judge Morrison said. 9 men are dead because you valued your pride more than human life. You dressed up mass murder as patriotism, as constitutional resistance. But the Founding Fathers you claim to revere created a nation of laws, precisely to prevent the kind of vigilante violence you committed. You had legal options. You chose murder instead. Lucas Patterson, death penalty. Cole Patterson, life without possibility of parole. Travis Patterson, life without parole. The courtroom was silent as sentences were read. Lucas showed no reaction. Cole put his face in his hands. Travis stared straight ahead, expression blank, already gone to some internal place where consequences couldn't reach him. Sarah Patterson collapsed in the gallery, had to be carried out by family members. The Patterson legacy, 90 years of moonshining tradition, ended in a Nashville courtroom with 3 life sentences and 9 federal agents dead. Lucas Patterson was executed by lethal injection on April 15, 1985, at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, 6 years after killing 9 federal agents. He was 61 years old. His final appeals had been exhausted, clemency petitions denied, Supreme Court refusing to hear his case. The execution was witnessed by families of the federal agents he'd murdered, by FBI officials, by reporters covering what had become a landmark case about domestic terrorism and mountain justice. Lucas's last words, recorded by prison officials, were brief and unrepentant. "I defended freedom against tyranny. I'd do it again. The Founding Fathers would understand, even if modern Americans don't." Then the chemicals flowed, and Lucas Patterson died strapped to a gurney, becoming the first person executed for killing federal agents since the 1950s. Sarah had divorced him in 1982, unable to reconcile the man she'd loved with the terrorist he'd become. She died of cancer in 1998, 72 years old, carrying guilt about whether she could have stopped the massacre if she'd spoken up earlier. Cole Patterson remains incarcerated at U.S. Terre Haute at age 75. Parole was never a possibility given his life without parole sentence. In a rare 2015 interview, Cole said only this: "I followed my father into darkness because that's what sons do in mountain families. I've had 36 years to think about the 9 men we killed. Still see their faces, still hear them begging. That's my punishment, worse than any prison." His wife Jennifer divorced him in 1984, remarried, moved to California with their children who barely remember their father exists. Travis Patterson died in prison in 2003, age 51, killed during a riot at USP Terre Haute when inmates took over a cell block for 6 hours. Prison records show Travis had been writing manifestos about government tyranny, had become a hero to white supremacist and anti-government groups, despite never identifying with those movements himself. His death was ruled accidental, caught in crossfire between inmates and guards, but some investigators suspected he'd been targeted by inmates who resented his notoriety. Dalton Patterson, the youngest son whose arrest had triggered everything, served 8 years in federal prison for moonshining charges, released in 1987 at age 32. He changed his name, moved to Oregon, worked construction, tried to build a life separate from his family's legacy. But the Patterson name followed him. Employers who learned his identity fired him. Neighbors who discovered his history shunned him. In 1994, at age 39, Dalton Patterson walked into the Oregon woods and was never seen again. Search teams found his truck at a trailhead, found his wallet and keys inside, never found a body. Official reports said presumed dead. Those who knew him said he'd finally found the only piece available. The 9 federal agents who died left behind 17 children, 8 widows, dozens of family members whose lives were destroyed by one night of violence. Robert Hendricks's widow raised their 2 children alone, never remarried, spent the rest of her life advocating for law enforcement families. James Mitchell's parents never recovered, both dying within 5 years. Michael Carson's fiancée, who'd been planning an August 1979 wedding, never married anyone else. The families scattered, some staying in Tennessee, most leaving to escape memories. All carried scars that never healed, trauma that passed to children who grew up without fathers because Lucas Patterson believed federal laws were tyrannical. The Patterson property was seized by the federal government in 1980, sold at auction in 1982, purchased by a developer who subdivided it into lots for vacation homes. Today, the land where 4 generations of Pattersons made moonshine and defied federal authority is covered with rental cabins for tourists, visiting the Smoky Mountains, people who have no idea about the blood soaked into soil they walk on. The sites where 9 federal agents died have been marked in various ways. A memorial at the Sleep Inn honors the 6 agents killed there. Bronze plaque with their names and dates. Words about sacrifice and service. Highway 321, where Robert Hendricks died, has a small roadside marker. The apartment complex where Carson and Wu died has changed ownership multiple times, nobody wanting to advertise its history. Thomas Bradley's house was sold, renovated, now occupied by a family who learned its history only after moving in. Some places remember violence. Others forget deliberately, covering horror with normal life, pretending blood doesn't stain deeper than paint can cover. 45 years have passed since that June night in Tennessee. The Patterson family legacy, 90 years of moonshining tradition and resistance to federal authority, died with Lucas on a lethal injection gurney and with his sons in federal prison. The recipe they'd protected, the methods passed down through 4 generations, ceased to exist. Knowledge that Ezra Patterson had developed in 1889 was lost because the last men who knew it were either dead or imprisoned for life, and they'd chosen to let it die rather than pass it to a generation that might repeat their mistakes. The raid on June 7, 1979, had destroyed $180,000 in equipment and arrested 1 man. The Patterson response on June 28th killed 9 federal agents and destroyed 3 families completely. The mathematics of that exchange, 9 deaths to avenge 1 arrest, revealed everything about how far Lucas Patterson had strayed from any recognizable moral framework, how completely his anti-government philosophy had corrupted his judgment. In the end, the federal government he'd fought against had won absolutely, had taken everything, had reduced the Patterson legacy to a cautionary tale about domestic terrorism rather than the patriotic resistance Lucas had imagined. Lucas Patterson's story has no heroes, no redemption, no satisfying conclusion where principles triumph. It has a father who valued pride and ideology more than 9 human lives, who convinced himself that murder was patriotism, who destroyed his family more completely than any federal raid ever could. It has federal agents who were just doing their jobs, enforcing laws they believed were legitimate, who died because one man's twisted interpretation of constitutional rights made their badges into death sentences. It has a system that failed at every level, federal laws that criminalized cultural traditions without offering economic alternatives, enforcement tactics that treated moonshiners like dangerous criminals rather than people struggling to survive, and a complete inability to bridge the gap between government authority and mountain independence. Was Lucas Patterson a domestic terrorist? Yes, unquestionably. He planned and executed the murder of 9 federal law enforcement officers with premeditation and coordination. He hunted men down in their homes, killed them while they slept, showed no mercy to people begging for their lives. He transformed his sons into accomplices to mass murder, destroying their lives to serve his ideology. Was he also a man driven to extremes by what he genuinely believed was government tyranny? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is, both things can be true simultaneously, and that's what makes this story so disturbing. It forces us to confront questions about where legitimate resistance to government overreach ends and terrorism begins, about whether sincerely held beliefs justify violence about the cost of ideological purity when measured in human lives. Lucas Patterson crossed boundaries no human should cross. But those boundaries existed in a world where federal agents raided moonshine operations with military force, where mountain culture was criminalized, where economic collapse left families with few options beyond illegal activity. Understanding that context doesn't excuse 9 murders, but it explains how an ordinary man convinced himself that mass murder was justified resistance. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where justice triumphs. Just blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides of a conflict that could have been resolved without violence if anyone had been willing to find middle ground. 45 years later, the 9 federal agents are still dead. Lucas and Travis Patterson are dead. Cole remains imprisoned, and nobody can agree whether the Pattersons were terrorists or freedom fighters. The mountains keep their secrets, offering no answers to questions that have no right answers to give. The Patterson legacy died in a federal execution chamber and concrete cages, a dynasty drowned by decisions made on one June night when a father decided that federal agents enforcing laws he disagreed with deserved death. When pride and rage and twisted constitutional arguments mattered more than 9 human lives. When anti-government ideology transformed into the deadliest attack on federal law enforcement America had seen. If this story made you think about government authority, individual rights, and the price paid when ideology justifies murder, remember that the line between patriotism and terrorism is drawn not in philosophy but in blood. And Lucas Patterson crossed that line the moment he decided his interpretation of freedom mattered more than 9 men's right to live.